Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of the AIM-plified podcast, brought to you by AIM Youth Mental Health. My name is Aerin Cohn,
And my name is Saisha Paul.
and we are AIM Youth Ambassadors.
We're so excited to be interviewing Dr. John Piacentini, Director of UCLA Child OCD, Anxiety, and Tic Disorders Program, Professor of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences, and an AIM Scientific Advisory Board member. Welcome, Dr. Piacentini. Thank you for being here. Could you start by introducing yourself?
Sure. I'm John Piacentini. I'm a professor at UCLA in the Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences. I'm a clinical child and adolescent psychologist, and my specialty is in OCD, anxiety, tic disorders, body focused repetitive behaviors, and cognitive behavioral therapy. And it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for being here. We're really excited. So, our first question for you is what originally drew you to pediatric psychology and specifically to working with children and teens with OCD, anxiety, and tic disorders?
That's a good question. I don't think there was any specific thing. I didn't start in college as a psychology major. I went through a few different things and I took a psychology class just, because I wanted to, and I fell in love with it. And like literally almost a light switch flipped and I decided I wanted to study psychology. I originally went to grad school to work on ADHD because that was the mentor I wanted to work with. And I did a little bit of anxiety and OCD therapy, but it wasn't really what I thought I would be doing until I was on my postdoc at Columbia University and got involved in an OCD study for kids, a medication study, and really liked working with OCD. And some of the kids didn't respond to medication, so we developed an OCD treatment for them, a therapy treatment, exposure and response prevention, and started treating kids with that and just never looked back. And if you work with OCD, you're going to work with Tourette's because they're very comorbid. And if you work with OCD and Tourette's, you're going to work with anxiety because those are also very comorbid. So, and now here I am.
Right, that's very cool. I took a psychology class once and definitely fell in love with it too, so I agree with you
Great.
there. Yeah. At your UCLA clinic, what changes are you seeing in how anxiety shows up in young people today compared to like 10 or 20 years ago?
That's a good question. I think before, way back, 20 years ago or so, we would see kids with anxiety, but maybe it would be a little more straightforward. There were some comorbidities, but a lot of the kids, it was really more focused on the anxiety. And I think some of that was because people didn't really recognize the comorbidities maybe to the same extent. People didn't really even understand anxiety to the same extent. Some of the kids that came into clinic were because they weren't going to school or they were even engaging in disruptive behaviors, and it really was about their anxiety. The schools and families really didn't know what it was until they'd actually gone through either talking to some people or even meeting with us. Now we see anxiety tends to come more complicated, a lot of comorbidities, different kinds of presentations. I think anxiety oftentimes now is we're seeing it as the primary problem. Before, anxiety might have been a secondary problem, again, because it wasn't recognized so much as a big issue leading to some of the difficulties that these kids were having. Now, parents and children also understand anxiety to a much greater extent. The schools understand anxiety. We're able to work with the schools maybe a little bit easier because everybody now knows what anxiety is, or most people do.
Have you seen like social media exacerbate it, would you say? Especially like within young kids since everyone's online?
I think social media has been fantastic for people with anxiety because it provides a lot of education. People understand anxiety. It tends to destigmatize anxiety. And I think social media can also be helpful in terms of there are some people on social media that provide help and different kinds of techniques that can be used. I also think social media can be horrible for anxiety because it can sensationalize anxiety. A lot of people are getting a lot of attention for being anxious. And we certainly want our anxious patients to understand anxiety and to get support for what they're going through and for their families. But, one of the really important things about anxiety is we don't want to reinforce it. And if I'm getting a lot of attention for my anxiety, I might be less willing to treat it. Anxiety might be something that makes me special or makes me different, and I may not want to let go of that. And that can be very difficult when we're trying to do treatment. There's also a lot of misinformation about anxiety on social media, and a lot of techniques, and people are providing advice that may or may not be helpful or accurate.
Yeah, it's interesting to see, as you were saying, how with recent trends like the rise of social media, how these patterns and anxiety have changed. So it's really great to hear about that. And going off of what you said about how schools now know more about it, our next question for you is a lot of teenagers feel pressure from academics and high achieving environments. So, what does the research tell us about how chronic stress affects youth mental health? And what realistic steps can schools take to support their students?
Great question. So stress is an adaptive function. Stress can be helpful in a lot of situations. Anxiety can be very helpful in a lot of situations too. If I'm anxious about something, it means something is wrong, and I'm going to be motivated to try to fix it. Stress can excite us, it can energize us, it can move us to take an action, and that can be positive or negative. I may be stressed out about going to a birthday party or going to an amusement park or going on a long trip because it's something new to me, but I'm really excited about that. I can also be stressed about schoolwork, or maybe being bullied at school, or maybe not understanding something, or maybe being in a fight with my friends. And those are negative aspects of stress. So stress cuts across all the different emotions. And when it's negative, that's when we're concerned. And that's when we see a lot more anxiety or fear related to that. So chronic stress really can be damaging if unchecked or untreated. We know that individuals under a lot of stress don't sleep as well. That can lead them to be obviously more tired, less able to concentrate, do more poorly in school. Cognitively, it can also, even without the sleep impacts, it can impact learning. If I'm all just worried or thinking about something bad that's going to happen, my brain isn't going to really be able to function and learn new material. The area of the brain that underlies stress and anxiety is also related to learning. So if I'm stressed all the time, there's a direct kind of a neural interference, a brain-based interference in my ability to learn new material. Because the only thing I'm thinking about or worrying about is how am I going to save myself or take care of myself. We know physically stress can impact our health. It can make us sick or more likely to get sick. It can impact in almost every way possible in a negative way.
I think it's interesting what you said. There's different ways kind of to think about it. It's like two-sided because there can be good and bad stress. Obviously, stress that can affect you and make you feel sick, or anything like that. But also, like, there's good stress if you're going to take a test, for example, and you might feel stressed. A lot of the teachers say that's good because that shows that you care and like that you're putting the time and attention towards that subject. Although it can cause you stress, there's two different ways to think about it. So I agree with what you were saying for sure. And then kind of going more back to like OCD, what's one myth about OCD or anxiety that like you wish we could all eliminate together as a society right now?
I think it's the same myth for both, and I'm going to tell you two of them. One is that anxiety or OCD is just a willful behavior. You're just doing this to get attention, or for other reasons. And related to that is that, yeah, you're doing this on purpose, and that can obviously is incorrect in many ways. The other myth, I think, is that anxiety, there's no treatment for anxiety or OCD. That if you have anxiety or OCD, you're going to have it for the rest of your life. And we know that's not true either. We have amazing treatments for these disorders. Some people are able to kind of grow out of anxiety and OCD. Not all, maybe not most, but oftentimes with age, we can learn to take a different view of our anxiety or OCD and become better able to maybe move past it or even turn it off or turn it down a little bit in situations where we need to get things done. It's not always that easy. Not everybody can do it. But people with anxiety and OCD have an ability to live amazing lives. And people before this time, people thought once you had these disorders, you had them for life and your life was pretty well over.
Yeah, it's nice to see how the kind of spectrum of treatments that we've developed has grown. And kind of going off of that, a lot of exposure based therapies can sound intimidating. So, what do you think most young people misunderstand about exposure therapy, and what do you wish they knew?
Well, in exposure therapy, we are identifying specific behaviors, and we're asking or specific feared situations that trigger the OCD behaviors. Like I'm afraid if I touch something, it's going to make me sick. And as a patient with OCD, I might do rituals. I might do excessive hand washing or cleaning or even praying or even moving in a certain way to avoid getting sick. And in treatment during exposure therapy, it's just what it sounds like. We want our patients to trigger their OCD, touch the surface or the thing that they think is going to contaminate them, and then not wash their hands. That's the response prevention part, exposure and response prevention. And over time, they learn through treatment that if I touch this thing I think is going to make me sick and I wait long enough, I don't get sick. So maybe my fear isn't real. It's just something that is part of my OCD. And the more I learn that I'm not going to get sick from touching something, the weaker this thought gets to the point where I can learn how to ignore it. What happens with most people, they just hear the part of, you want me to do the stuff that is really scary and frightening. And you want me to come and for treatment, I have to touch all the things that I'm afraid to touch. Well, that can be really, really scary. And that can scare people away from treatment. It can scare parents away from letting their kids do treatment. It just is really difficult to think about, especially if the OCD is severe, or the anxiety. I'm afraid of dogs, so I don't go to the park. Well, exposure therapy would be, we're going to go to the park and we're going to look for some dogs, but we're going to do it in a very careful way. We're going to start really slow, little dogs, and we're going to work our way up and to the point where you're going to realize that dogs are okay. Well, all the patient hears and maybe all the parent hears is, we're going to get the thing that you are most afraid of, and then we're going to go to the park and look for all these dogs. And the patient is just thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to get bitten by a dog today. And I wouldn't want to do that treatment if I had those thoughts. So what we need to let our patients know is that, the things we do, the exposures that we do in therapy really are done very carefully. They're done thoughtfully. And we are focusing on fears that our patients have that really aren't grounded necessarily in the reality of the situation. That your fear of dogs, your fear of getting sick are not realistic given the situation. So we're not asking you to do things that are dangerous. We're asking you to do things so that you can learn that they're not dangerous.
Right. What does like exposure therapy look like for maybe like a younger patient as opposed to an older one, or is it the same type of idea?
It's the same general idea, but for younger children, and we've worked with kids as young as about 3 years old. Not often, but that's probably the youngest we've worked with. A lot of it is with the parents, and a lot of it is in games, or we're going to be playing games with kids. So a young child that might be afraid to, again, touch something because they think it's contaminated, we would make it into a game, and we would have a lot of reinforcers, and we would all touch something, and then we would ask them to touch it. And if they can't touch it, maybe mom could touch it and they could touch mom. And if mom is touching it, maybe they touch mom on her shoulder because that's pretty far away from what mom is doing. And maybe over time, we have the patient get a little bit closer and closer and closer. So they're actually touching mom's finger while mom's touching it. And then we can get them to touch it on their own. Is it one example? Or, the same thing, like if we have a fear of animals or something, gradually we would start with a very, very, cute little small non-threatening animal or a non-threatening situation, and then gradually work up to more difficult situations.
Got it. So it's kind of like you take it little by little until you're
Mm-hmm.
at like the major end. Got it.
Right. We call it graduated exposure. And exposure is kind of a weird word. Another way to think about exposure is approach. Like we want you to be able to approach something and be able to approach it in a way that you get close enough so that you can actually touch it or handle it or do whatever it is that you need to do with it.
Got it. Um, okay, so now we kind of want to focus a little bit more on your work. You've contributed to more than 300 scientific publications, which is amazing. What breakthroughs in treatment or brain science are you most excited about? right now?
There's a couple of things. I think one of the things that I think has been really exciting about our work is I've been part of a number of larger scale studies where we've tested treatments for OCD, anxiety, and Tourette's or tic disorders. And in our Tourette's work, our tic disorder study, using a form of exposure therapy called habit reversal training, we actually followed these kids up. And 9 years later, we found that the kids that had responded to our behavioral treatment were doing better than those that hadn't. And the gains had largely maintained for over 9 years of treatment. And that really tells you about the durability of these treatments. In our anxiety study, we followed the kids for about 6 to 8 years after treatment with medication. The kids either got medication, cognitive behavior therapy, or the combination of both. And we found that the kids who had received cognitive behavior therapy with or without medication were doing quite well, and they were doing better than the kids that had medication only, suggesting that a lot of the long-term benefits of treatment come from the cognitive behavior therapy. They were doing better academically, they were doing better in terms of work history, in terms of social history. And I think that goes to show why cognitive behavior therapy or behavioral treatments are so important, because we're actually teaching our patients the skills that they need to navigate difficult situations. They're learning to see the world in a different view, not a world that is frightening to them or poisonous to them, but in a world that they can understand and that they can manage. And I think those were the two most exciting things, that these therapies do seem to be quite durable over long periods of time, and importantly, durable from childhood and adolescence into adulthood.
I guess like my follow up for that would be like, what are the biggest limitations or risks that people don't always talk about, but that you've researched, like in your publications or something like that?
In terms of risks of treatment, you mean, or?
Yeah, like within treatment, different types of like therapy, whatever it is.
Well, I think, I mean, the risks of treatment, of course, that it may not work. It doesn't work for everybody. So that's one of the things, and one of the things in our research we're also trying to do is to understand if we can identify which treatments work best for which patients. So, and some of that work is we're looking at the mechanisms of treatment. So we don't really want to just focus on the symptoms, because there's something driving symptoms, that are driving these disorders. And Tourette's is brain based. Even anxiety, there's kind of a brain basis for anxiety, overactivity in certain parts of the brain, for example. And we want to try to get a better understanding of what are the causes, kind of these underlying causes, and can we fix these causes? Can we change these factors? So I think that's an important part of this. I think, but the one risk is that not everybody gets better. Certainly with medication, there are side effects. With therapy, sometimes not necessarily side effects, but it can be very frightening when you're starting out doing exposure therapies, or when we're working with our patients with Tourette's. And in Tourette's, we ask the patients, whenever time they have an urge to do a tic, because most tics are preceded by urges, we're teaching them to hold on to the urge, to manage the urge without giving in to their tic. And that can be difficult as well. It can be hard to do. Over time, our patients get better at it and it seems to help, but it doesn't always work for everyone.
Yeah, if you're both sides, like how the patient interprets the treatment versus like the benefits, and kind of going off of like what other things can be done to help someone, what do you think families or peers or even communities can do that can genuinely help a young person who's struggling with something like anxiety or OCD?
That's a great question, because no patient, individual, child, or adult with OCD or anxiety is going to get better on their own. They need the help of friends, colleagues, spouses, schools, teachers, parents. It's really important, because what we're trying to do with these treatments is we're trying to create an environment that is conducive to supporting our patients as they do the work that they're doing. If we're working with a patient that has OCD and they're very self-conscious and they're very anxious, and every time they do a ritual at school, say they have to stomp their foot 3 times, or they need to wash their hands or say a certain word, and everybody in the class laughs, that's going to make them more anxious, and that's going to worsen their OCD. So if a child is working really hard in therapy to get better, but occasionally they're going to slip into a symptom and they're in a social setting and everybody laughs, it really makes it difficult for them to continue maintaining their gains. So it's really important that the people around our patients are able to support them in their work rather than not. With anxiety as well, with kids that are anxious, may live in a home where other family members are anxious. And if the child has learned, or OCD, the child has learned to be able to touch a dirty dish and clean their dirty dishes before they weren't able to do that. If other members of the family say, don't touch that, it's contaminated, then that's not helping the child with their therapy. So it's really important that families and other people are playing an active role. We don't always let the school know. Sometimes parents don't want the school to know that the child is in therapy. And in those cases, we need to be careful, what we say or who we talk to. But most kids with anxiety and OCD, their friends know and people around them that know them know. So it's important that we're able to work with as many people in their lives as we can to help them support the child.
I think it's very important what you said. Like, the environment that you're in can definitely dictate how you go on with future situations. So that's a great point. And then also, our next question is, what excites you most about the next generation of youth mental health advocates?
I think you all are part of that generation. You all are educated. You understand these disorders in ways that prior generations didn't. The world is more open now to people with different kinds of mental health challenges. Before, the typical response might have been being teased or ignored. 30, 40 years ago, people didn't understand mental health in the way that we do now. There's such a great understanding, in large part by the work that you all are doing and that AIM is doing and that others are doing to help people understand this. So, ambassadors can really spread the word and educate people, educate society about these disorders. The fact again that they're not the patient's faults. These are really great individuals who are suffering a challenge. Everybody has a challenge of one kind or another. It might not be mental health, it might be physical health. There may be other issues, but it's so important to support and educate the population. And I think that's a really critical piece of this.
Yeah, like you said, it's so nice to see like how far everyone has come in their education of these disorders and just mental health research in general. And it's super exciting to see where like the next generation of researchers will go in the next few years. So what advice would you give a young person who wants to pursue a career in child clinical psychology or just mental health research in general?
That's a great question. I would try to learn as much as you can. Try to read about this, look for people that or that you want to reach out to at your school or in your community, about opportunities, getting involved early, like you both are doing. And I think the most helpful thing, if you're really serious about this, as you start doing this work, find a mentor. Most people that have come through this, and myself, I was very fortunate to find people that worked in these areas, even as a student, even in college, that could just help me and motivate me and that I could talk to about what I wanted to do. And they really, really provided a lot of support for me. And I know a lot of my colleagues will say the same things. Finding somebody that is motivated to help you and that wants to help you, I think is really a critical piece. But really just learn as much as you can and get involved in any way that you can. And that will be really important.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you so much for sharing your time and insight with us today. We're both incredibly grateful for your work. And this was such a great conversation. And I think that you've given us both great perspective. So thank you so much. You did a great
I
job.
really enjoyed it. And thank you all for the work that you're doing and the work you're doing with AIM. So that's great. Thank you very much.